Well, hey guys, we're going all over the place today. We're going to visit several spots in Mississippi, of course, and several in Alabama, and we're doing this so we can better understand the story of Confederate Major General Earl VanDorn. Before old Earl became infamous as an Army commander, he was born on September the 17th, 1820, in Port Gibson, Mississippi, in his father Peter's home. Earl was murdered on May 7, 1863, in Spring Hill, Tennessee, but we've got a bit before we get to that. President Andrew Jackson owned property not too terribly far from Peter Van Dorn's home in Port Gibson, and Earl's mother was President Jackson's niece. Earl led a rather privileged life, and when it came time for him to request an appointment to West Point, well, President Jackson helped him get it. Earl VanDorn graduated from West Point in 1842. He ranked 52 out of 56 candidates. He got demerits for all kind of crazy reasons. In his first appointment outside of West Point, he was stationed at Fort Morgan, Alabama. He would split time between Fort Morgan and the Arsenal in Mount Vernon, Alabama, a few miles north. While in Mount Vernon, he became acquainted with Caroline Godbold. They struck up quite the relationship, and they were married in 1843. They continued to live with her parents in Mount Vernon, and in 1852 they had their first child, Olivia. Olivia was followed by Earl Jr. in 1854. Earl's wife, Caroline, continued to live with her parents when the Army sent him to Texas. Earl VanDorn made a name for himself in the Mexican War and fighting the Indian Wars, specifically the Comanche. At one point, he was shot with 2 different arrows, pulling one of them out himself. While in Texas, Earl met a lady named Martha Goodbread. Martha and Earl had a child named Percy in 1856. They had a girl named Lemmy Bell in 1858, and they had a son named Douglas in 1861. Earl VanDorn resigned from the United States Army in January of 1861 and came back to Alabama. He was named Major General in 1861 and was stationed in Virginia with the Confederate Army, but soon came west. You're looking around the old railroad depot in Holly Springs, Mississippi right now. The action here probably the pinnacle of Earl's military career, but before we get to that, Earl first rather successfully strengthened the defenses around Vicksburg, and then he received Army command. His armies lost the Battle of Pea Ridge, Arkansas, and then what I call the Second Battle of Corinth. You're driving by the site of the old armory in Holly Springs, and well, after Corinth, Earl lost command of his army. On December the 20th, 1862, he led a cavalry unit here in Holly Springs. They stormed the parade ground, the old railroad depot, and the armory, and captured many goods and supplies, and well destroyed Grant's supply base. Undoubtedly, they rode right by Walter Place, the home you're looking at now. Mr. Walter brought the Mississippi Central Railroad to Holly Springs, the same thing that brought the war here, and ironically, he opposed secession but became a colonel in the Confederate service. Ulysses Grant and his wife Julia stayed here at Walter Place during their time in Holly Springs. Not too long after the Battle of Holly Springs, Earl moved the cavalry to Spring Hill, Tennessee. The United States troops were just up the road in Franklin when he made this home, White Hall, his headquarters. White Hall was built for Dr. Aaron Wright by his brother Henry in 1844. While here, Major General Earl VanDorn had a grand old time. He staged many reviews and, well, he partied a whole lot. Somewhere in this time, he met 25-year-old Jessie McKissick Peters. Jessie was the young wife of 52-year-old Dr. George Bodie Peters, who was a former state legislator and Jessie's first cousin once removed. Well, folklore has it that the relationship that Mrs. Peters and the Major General struck up when she came and visited this home embarrassed Mrs. White, and she told her husband to get the General out. You see, the General had taken over most all her home and left her family in this back kitchen wing. And with the embarrassment of all the gossip, that was simply too much. The Major General then moved his headquarters to a home called Ferguson Hall. Ferguson Hall was owned by a guy named Martin Cheers, and he was the oldest of the three Cheers boys. They made money selling agricultural goods mostly to the Confederate armies during the Civil War. One of the other Cheers brothers owns the home Ripavilla, if you've ever been through this part of the country. Dr. Peters entered the home and shot VanDorn as he sat at a desk right in front of that bottom right window on May 7, 1863. It has been said that Dr. Peters was away on business, and when he returned to Spring Hill, he found out about the affair that his young wife Jessie was having with the Major General. One version of the story says that he demanded a written apology from the Major General, and when he went to pick it up, he didn't get it, so he shot him. The other story was that he simply was here to request a pass through the lines so he could travel to Nashville, and when the general completed his pass, he shot him in the back of the head. Eventually, Earl's body was transported back to Mount Vernon, Alabama, for burial in his wife's family cemetery. Caroline was so stricken with grief that she could not leave her room during the funeral. Or maybe she had seen the Mobile newspaper that referred to the Major General as the terror of ugly husbands. Dr. Peters fled to Nashville after he murdered Major General Earl VanDorn, but you need to know that he had a daughter by his first wife that was 15 or 16 years old, and her name was Clara. When you meet Clara, things get a little bit murky. We're in Memphis in Elmwood Cemetery. That bright spot on the left is Dr. Peters' grave, and Jessie is there beside him, and Medora is there on the right. Newspapers of the day interviewed VanDorn's staff officers after the murder, trying to determine motive. The officers said that Dr. Peters was a Unionist and had shot VanDorn with a small derringer. They also told the newspaper that VanDorn was not with Jessie. They were around him all the time, and they would know. And here's the important one for me. He only saw Clara, the 15-year-old, once. If you do much Civil War research, you know what the official records are, and you know there is no mention of Earl VanDorn's murder in the official records. That's pretty striking for me. A little while later, Clara enrolls at the Academy of Visitation in St. Louis. This is a convent Catholic school, but the Petersons were not Catholic. Medora was born in 1864 in Memphis, but Jessie, her mother, reportedly was in Spring Hill. The family did have many relatives in Memphis and even owned some property in Arkansas. In a very short while, George and Jessie divorced. In 1965, Dr. Peters' son committed suicide, and in 1968, Dr. Peters stabbed a man. Dr. Peters and Jessie remarried somewhere in Kentucky in 1968 as well. About this time, Clara joined the convent at the school and became Sister Mary Paula. According to the 1880 census, Medora is in Arkansas with George and Jessie living as their daughter. She was also a student at the Academy of Visitation, where Clara was a music teacher. About this time, Dr. Peters has a cousin that wrote a letter to his mom in Mississippi. In that letter, the cousin says that the rumors about Jessie were not true, that it was indeed Clara who had the baby. If that is true, you can only surmise that maybe Jessie took this on to help Clara and Medora, or especially Dora, to have a normal life. Perhaps it was forced on her, but one thing is for sure, no one talked. No one in the community, no one in the army, no one. In November of 1899, Major General Earl VanDorn's sister had his body moved to Port Gibson, Mississippi. She had his casket opened and wrote about how splendid her brother looked in his long blonde curls and his impeccable Confederate uniform. Major General VanDorn is buried next to his father in Greenwood Cemetery in Port Gibson. Dr. Peters and Medora and Jessie are buried in Elmwood in Memphis. At some point, Dr. Peters said he shot Earl VanDorn because he violated the sanctity of his home.